Welcome everybody to the CARP webinar. We're going to get underway in just a couple of minutes. We'd ask you or suggest to you that you go to the view button, which for most computers is at the top right part of your screen, and on it you will get the choice of either gallery view or speaker view or full screen. We suggest you put it on speaker view, and then if there are any slides to be shown, you'll be able to see them all. If you have any questions, please put them into the chat. I will be reviewing the questions in the chat and passing them on to our chair, Ron Swan. So if we're all ready, Ron, you can unmute yourself, and I will let you get underway.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you here this afternoon. I wish it could be an in-person meeting, but we all know it cannot be. So here we are, and of course we may not have as many people attending if we're not being done virtual as well. So anyway, we're going to start a conversation today on inclusion and accessibility. What does it mean to you? And I expect it means something possibly a little different to all of us. So today is very much about starting a conversation within the context of this meeting, having some community leaders and Cecil and Gerry and Jacquie to share their experiences with us and to bring some additional insight and context to our conversation, to ask some questions. But then after our meeting's over, this is not about a presentation, and wasn't that a great presentation? This is about starting a conversation with each other to finish this meeting and to be able to sit down and talk to your partners, your family, people in your community, to say, hey, look, I just sat in on this meeting called Inclusion and Accessibility, and I got a different perspective. I'm hoping that's what comes from today. So that all being said, what I'd like to do is introduce our three guest speakers. And I'll start out with Cecil Wright. And Cecil is a sports broadcaster for about 33 years and counting. In addition to hosting and producing radio, he hosts the Cecil Wright Show on Eastlink TV, Let's Talk Sports, and Moving and Grooving on C10E 97.5 FM. Cecil, for many years, I met Cecil many years ago. I can't tell you exactly the year it was, but he worked with my wife at Public Safety Canada at the National Crime Prevention Strategy. And that's how I got to meet Cecil. And over that time, I learned that he's a sports fanatic for one thing. He's a player, he's a coach and a mentor in baseball, and is in the Sports Hall of Fame. At the same time too, in Canada, and he's also a friend, a fellow board member, and a community leader. So thank you for being part of our panel today, Cecil. The next person as part of our panel is Gerry Post. And Gerry is an advocate for persons with disabilities who has worked to improve the Accessibility Act in Nova Scotia and was the first executive director for the Accessibility Directorate. Gerry was awarded in 2017 the James McGregor Stewart Award in recognition of his exceptional achievement in spearheading in the improvements of the Accessibility Act. The McGregor Stewart Society described Mr. Post as someone who leads and excels regardless of boundaries and is a force of nature. So that's quite an accolade for sure. Under the Accessibility Act, government will work with persons with disabilities, municipalities, not-for-profits, and business to create standards in the areas of goods and services, information, communication, public transportation, and transportation infrastructure, employment, education, and built environment which includes buildings, right-of-ways, and outdoor spaces. So, Gerry, thank you so much for being one of our panelists here this afternoon. Our third and final panelist is Jacqueline Cahagan. Dr. Cahagan, Ph.D., is a full professor at the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie. And I'm going to ask Paula Wedge, who is my vice chair for CARP Nova Scotia, to introduce Jacquie to the audience here this afternoon. Bill, maybe you can let Paula have the mic.
Paula has to unmute. There you are. Good.
There I am. Hello, everybody. When Ron asked me who would be the right person to speak about some of the challenges facing the aging LGBTQ2S+ communities, my good friend and ally, Dr. Jacquie Gahagan, immediately came to mind. I cannot describe Jacquie in only a few minutes. She is an accomplished scholar, teacher, researcher, author, mentor, and activist in the LGBTQ2S+ communities. And I'm happy to say that she has a great sense of humor. Jacquie has a Ph.D. and is a full professor and medical sociologist in the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie University, where they teach the BSc and MA health promotion programs. She's going to focus on how issues of inclusion and accessibility impact the health and social outcomes of older LGBTQ2S+ Canadians, particularly in relation to housing as a key determinant of health. In addition, Jacquie will speak to the issue of foregone healthcare, which occurs when LGBTQ2S+ seniors avoid needed healthcare due to stigma, harassment, and mistreatment by healthcare providers and systems. So there.
Thank you very much, Paula. And just before we get underway with our presentations and to bring some additional context to our conversation here this afternoon, again, as I mentioned at the outset, we're going to be talking about inclusion. And when I say inclusion, I guess I include diversity within inclusion. Inclusion means that all people, regardless of their abilities, disabilities, or healthcare needs, have the right to be respected and appreciated as valuable members of their communities. And diversity is in any dimension that can be used to differentiate groups or people from one another. In a nutshell, it's about empowering people by respecting and appreciating what makes them different in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, education, or national origin. Accessibility means that people can do what they need to do in a similar amount of time and effort as someone that does not have a disability. It means that people are empowered, can be independent, will not be frustrated by something that is poorly designed and implemented regardless of their abilities. The reality is that CARP is an advocacy organization for older Canadians and older Nova Scotians right here at home. We grew up in a generation where these topics were not part of our conversation. And so that's very much what this is about today, is starting this conversation so that we can talk today and then go back and talk at home and in our communities to make Nova Scotia a better place to live. So that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Cecil Wright right now, who is going to be speaking with us about inclusion.
Well, thanks very much, Ron, and welcome everybody. I consider this a huge honor to speak to you all just about my own little journey and how I've been able to deal with certain things that maybe some of the rest of you fortunately haven't had to go through. So I'd just like to get you to try to imagine being in my shoes, okay? I started off my little journey right here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. A lot of people who know me from sports think that I'm an American. I'm not. I was born here in Halifax. Never wanted, hi Karen. Never, never ever wanted to be an American. So I never got my papers down there, even though I lived there for 23 years. Because at the age of 6, my parents moved from Beachville, Nova Scotia, which is a small Black community just outside Halifax, to Roxbury, Massachusetts, which is the large Black section of Boston. And the reason why they moved there was because, you know, you can imagine, as Ron was saying, these are the types of discussions that we did not have back in the 50s and early 60s. And it was in the early 60s when my parents you know, were having trouble getting meaningful employment in Halifax. And my maternal grandmother had married and moved to Boston. And she said that, you know, they were in conversation, and she told my parents that she knew a man who owned office buildings in Boston, and he was always looking for help. So if they wanted to, you know, feel free to come on down and move in with her and her husband. Until, you know, we're in such a situation where we could provide for ourselves. So my mother had been like cleaning motel rooms, and my father was a laborer. My father was at the time a very, very impressive physical physique. So everybody who saw him, you know, wanted him to do labor for him, but, you know, the pay was terrible. So they figured they had nothing to lose. And along with their little 6-year-old boy who was very upset at leaving all his friends and cousins behind. Like, what 6-year-old boy wants to leave all his friends and relatives? None. So we moved to Boston. And from the time I set foot on that airplane, I promised myself that when the time was right, I was going to be returning to Nova Scotia, you know, which was pretty bold for a 6-year-old to be thinking that way. I cried like a baby getting on the plane, you know, thinking I was probably never going to see my cousins again. But we went away, and both my parents got jobs with this man that my grandmother knew, and my father, in the process of getting his job, and all he was he was a porter. He was operating like the elevators and moving boxes around, that type of thing. Something that was okay for maybe a youngster to be doing, but not anything to build a career on. So he built up a nice relationship with this man that he would see every day. And the man said to him, what is it that you want to do? This isn't what you want to do for the rest of your life. And my father told him, well, you know, back in Nova Scotia, I was a laborer, but I really liked driving heavy equipment trucks. And he had his license for that. And so the man said, okay, well, let me see what I can do. Little did my father know that this man was a selectman, which would be the equivalent of a counselor here in Halifax. He was a selectman for this small town southwest of Boston called Holliston, Massachusetts. And so he had a chat with this highway department superintendent. There was an opening that was coming up, and the selectman, his name was Mr. Lovewell, said to the highway department superintendent, look, I got a guy that you got to meet this guy. He's got his heavy equipment license, and he's just an awesome guy. You got to meet him. So on a Sunday night, I'll never forget, you know how there are things that you just never forget? This is one of them. On a Sunday night, after grade 3, We drove out to Holliston, Massachusetts, to the superintendent's house. He had a farm with like farm animals, horses, ponies, chickens, ducks, geese, everything running all over the place. It was the first time in my life I had ever seen real live farm animals. And he interviewed my father, just him. You know, there was no board, any, you know, selection board. It was just him. And we found out years later that as soon as Mr. Hulbert, that was his name, Roy Hulbert, originally from Bayfield, Nova Scotia, when he found out that my father was Nova Scotian, he had the job right there. But my father didn't know it. They went through the entire interview, and you know, a couple days later, you know, my father got the word that he got the job, and that set other things in motion. Like they had to go back to Holliston, my mother and father, to look for a home. They weren't in a position to buy a home, but they had enough money to rent a home. Problem was, we would have been the 6th Black family to move into this small community, and nobody would rent to my parents. They went to one place, nope, not interested, sorry, got nothing. Went to another, had the door slammed in their face. They finally thought they had an opportunity when they went to another real estate agent, and it was a younger person, you know, around their age that they were speaking to. And the guy seemed real excited and said, yeah, I think we got a couple places that you might want to look at. And, you know, he went and got a book with some pictures, and they started flipping through, and then the door flew open, and in comes the owner of this real estate agency. And he says, what's going on here? And so the guy says, you know, his employee says, well, Mr. and Mrs. Wright, they're looking to rent a home here in Holliston. Mr. Wright just got a job. He's going to be starting in 2 weeks. And the owner said, well, we have no vacancies. And his own employee was like, what are you talking about? We got 2 or 3 right here. And he said, I said we have no vacancies. So, you know, my parents, as you can imagine, very dejectedly walked out of that office. And, you know, it was a June day, so it was hot. So they just stood outside the office under an awning, you know, just to catch their breath for a minute or two and, you know, shake off the disappointment and plan what their next move was. When this truck comes across the street, pulls into the parking lot right next to him, and a little black man gets out of the truck. He goes right up to him and says, hey, who are you two? You must be new here because I haven't seen you before. I'd know you if you were from this town. So, you know, my father says, well, no, we're looking to rent a home here, but no one will rent to us. I'm Cecil, and this is my wife, Eileen. And he said, the man said, how big a home are you looking for? And my mother says, well, just a small 2-bedroom. It's just us 2 and our son, you know, but, you know, pretty bad right now. And he got right excited. He said, don't you 2 move. You stay right here. I got to go inside for a second, but don't you move. I'm coming right back. And so he goes inside, and my mother told me this story years later. This is how it's like it's very fresh in my mind. My father said to my mother, you think this guy's nuts or what? He's got to be nuts because, you know, nobody does this for people. And my mother said, I don't care if he is nuts as long as he's got a small 2-bedroom home that he can rent to us. So he comes out of the store. He says, okay, follow me. It's only a couple of minutes up the road. Just follow me. So they followed him right across the street from the middle school, about 500 yards from the elementary school that I would be attending if we were to move into this little house. He drives down this driveway, a long driveway, past his own home. And on the edge of his property, he had a small 2-bedroom house. And so they get out of their vehicles, and he unlocks the door and says, now go on in, take a look, you know, take as much time as you need. And when you're finished, just come on up to the main house and we'll talk. So my parents went in, took a look around, everything was in good order. That's how we moved to that town. If 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, I don't know. And I really don't think that we would have had the opportunity to move to Holliston because, as I said, nobody would rent to my parents. And they didn't want to think that it was because of the color of their skin, but I'm pretty sure that that was the reason why. And so, you know, God just placed Mr. Gomes, Joe Gomes was that man's name, placed him right in a situation to help somebody who needed help the most at the proper time. And we lived in his house for about a year and a half before my parents had enough money to purchase their own home. And, you know, that's the good part of this story. Now, the bad part is some of the experiences that I had to go through to make it through. And I don't have enough time to go into all of them, but I'm just going to tell you, get you to follow me on a couple. My first day on the playground at my new school, the Miller School in Holliston, was grade 4. And I had one friend that I had met the night that we came out to the superintendent's house. His name was Skip. He lived down the road from the superintendent, and he was at the superintendent's home to play with the superintendent's son, who was a couple of years younger than we were. So he was the first guy I met. And so when I got to grade 4, we were in the same class. And that really saved my life, because when I was showing up on the playground, I was the new guy, plus I was the black guy. So all the local tough guys, they were just lining up ready to take shots at me when I got to school in the morning. And it wasn't until about, I'd say, a week later that Skip and I arranged that we were going to meet each other on the way to school, because he recognized what was going on along with my grade 4 teacher. And my grade 4 teacher, when she realized what was going on, she contacted my parents and came to my parents' house, our house, for dinner, just to tell my parents that she saw what was going on in the playground, and there was going to be no more of that. They didn't have to worry about stuff going on with their son. Of course, their son didn't know that. And the son went home and said to his father, I'm not going back to that school, and you can't make me, because all I'm doing is getting into fights with these boys. He says, I get just the thing that's going to cure your problem. I'm like, yeah, sure. What is that? He said, you are going to sign up for Little League Baseball. I'm like, nah, bad idea, Dad. You don't know these kids. And he said, as soon as they see how you can throw that ball, they're all going to want you to be on their team. You just watch. So I reluctantly went to Little League Baseball tryouts. Being that we were in the greater Boston area, I wanted to be picked to play for the Red Sox, and I got picked to play for the Giants. And so I was upset about that. And this is how intelligent, how smart a man my father was. He didn't go to the tryout because he knew that would put a lot of pressure on me. So he waited till I got home, says, so how'd everything go? I'm like, yeah, wonderful. I get picked for the old stupid Giants. I want to play for the Red Sox, but no, they wouldn't even take me on the Red Sox. I got to play for the stupid old Giants. He goes, the Giants, oh my God, they got the best player in baseball. Willie Mays is his name. Wait till you see him. He's unbelievable. So now I'm thinking, well, maybe being on the Giants isn't the worst thing in the world. And I did have an opportunity to see Willie Mays play, and my dad was right. Willie Mays, for those of you who know baseball, was one of the greatest baseball players in history. So that made it acceptable for me to be on the Giants. And it really wouldn't have mattered what team had selected me. My father would have found somebody on that team to say he was an unbelievable player and a great role model. You got to see him. That's how my father's mind worked. But you never would have really known it, because he was a real quiet, laid back guy, unlike myself. Right, Karen? So that started things on the way to being able to be assimilated with some of the other kids. Now, as I grew, I had a couple incidents. One I'll tell you about real quick. Grade 6, had my favorite teacher of all time. Mr. Gagne was my teacher, a former state trooper in Boston, big man, but his mantra was honesty is the best policy, which got me in trouble the following year, and I'll tell you. But anyway, in grade 6, we were playing basketball in gym one day, and I had a real good day. I was hitting everything. And the guy who was guarding me was having difficulty handling the fact that I was playing so well. So after it was over, we were lining up, getting ready to go back to class. And somebody said something to him about what a good player I was. And he called me the N-word. Everybody heard it. The gym teacher heard it, but nobody wanted to admit that they heard it, So we go back to class, and one of my classmates told Mr. Gahagan, my grade 6 teacher, and he went over and grabbed the young man who called me the name by the collar, yanked him out of his seat, marched him up to the principal's office, and we didn't see the guy for a couple hours. And eventually what happened was he was told if he didn't apologize to me, he was going to be suspended for 3 days. Now, this is grade 6. Grade 6 students don't get suspended. So, but he apologized to me, and that is the only conversation I ever had with him. And we graduated high school together some 6 years later. Now, that'll tell you a little bit about his upbringing, I think. I don't blame him so much as I do for the conditions that made it allowable for him to say it in the first place. And then in grade 7, in gym class of all places, I got myself in trouble because we had taken a test, and we got the test back, and one of my questions was marked incorrectly. Like Mr. Martino, the gym teacher, had marked the question I had wrong correctly. And so I'm thinking to myself, should I just shut up and let it go? And then Mr. Gahagan came back into my mind. Honesty is the best policy. So I raised my hand. I said, Mr. Martino, you marked this question correct, but it was incorrect. And he was like, oh, get out of here, Wright. Don't come, leave me alone with that stuff. So, here I am totally embarrassed and humiliated in front of the rest of my classmates. And so we went ahead and finished whatever activity we were doing for the day. And so afterwards, we're, in the locker room, everybody's getting, showering up, getting ready to go.
You're muted.
I think we're having some technical difficulty here, Bill.
Yeah, Cecil is, his computer has
It's frozen.
frozen on him.
All right. Look, why don't we take and we'll come back to Cecil when his technical problems are resolved. But maybe Jackie, if you could talk with us, and because we're running a little bit behind as it is, and what's most important is we have a good conversation with our audience here today too. Can you, Bill, can you open up Jackie so that she can speak with us?
She just has to unmute herself.
Oh, okay. Jackie, you unmuted?
I think we've lost her.
Did we lose Jackie? Oh, gosh. Gerry, I see you
Yes,
front and
we
center.
have, yeah.
Gerry's, you're muted right now, Gerry.
Oh, I'm still here.
You're still here. Yeah, we've had a technology challenging day, put it that way. But
Yes.
that being said, if you could talk with us about accessibility, because I'll tell you the word accessibility in this province, and I think two people. I think of you and I think of Kevin Murphy. So.
Right. Well, first of all, Ron and Bill, thanks so much for organizing this, and for everybody to attend our session as well. So Bill, if you could have the slides, it'd be nice. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is, put the lens on accessibility for seniors in particular, Cecil started with a little story, and I'll start with a little story as well. I became disabled the year before I turned 65, which was about 7-8 years ago. And one of the first things that I discovered as well was, some of the discrimination that takes place in community. in the disability community called ableism instead of racism. But it's very, very similar. And the first time I encountered it was, well, first trying to find an accessible apartment is nearly impossible. But is entering one of the stores on Spring Garden Road. And of course, a lot of the buildings are older, difficult to get into. So when I found out about this program where people will make portable ramps, so I approached the shop owner and I said, listen, if you'd like, I could arrange for you to have a portable ramp so I can get into your store. There'd be no cost. I have a donor that's willing to provide you with the ramp. And he said, no, thanks. And I said, well, why would you refuse me entry? He says, well, once you get into the store, I'm going to have to, widen the aisles for persons with wheelchairs and walkers, and that will restrict my space. So yeah, it takes place. And to this day, his store is inaccessible, although he's offered many times a free ramp. Anyway, so the next slide, Bill. One of the things, this whole thing of gray tsunami, I think we've all heard of that. And before I became a senior, I always wondered, why do they associate aging with a disaster? And perhaps it's because of the percentage of persons with disabilities who are seniors. And that's something I want to talk to for a few minutes. In Canada, 22% of our population in Canada has at least one form of disability. In Nova Scotia, we're at 30% for the general population. It's 40%, 41% for seniors. We are the highest in Canada. Reason for that is that we're also the oldest population in Canada, generally. And of course, when you have a disability like myself, you don't walk or roll alone. It affects your family members, it affects your friends and what have you. So for seniors, at least half of our cohort with their partners are affected by disability. Next slide. So, and those numbers, of course, are quite alarming. And as a result of it, there's been a lot of work done over the years. And Ron mentioned Kevin Murphy, who's been disabled for many more years than I have, as well as many others, have been working away within our province on developing an Accessibility Act. And a big part of that demographic were the seniors. And one of the things I'm sharing with you as well here is a bit of a slide that shows you the population growth for Nova Scotia. And these are numbers that are prepared by Stats Canada. So they use a very rigorous process. And as you see, between now and say 2040, most of the growth in population in Nova Scotia are the cohort of people over 65 years of age. In fact, we will be experiencing a decline of persons under 64. But to this day, we remain designing our entire environment, including our programs and what have you, for that demographic that's younger than we are, and which is unfortunate. So this is I think a very important slide. And what we're trying to do in the province now is hopefully try and stay ahead of the curve, which is difficult because institutions are generally quite slow to respond to these growing trends. Next slide. But what the province did about 3 years ago, well, it was about 5 years ago, actually, when there was an election, or 6 years ago, the Liberal Party at the time made a commitment for an Accessibility Act. When they got elected, one of the first things they did, they appointed Kevin Murphy, the Honorable Kevin Murphy, as Speaker of the House, as a sign of the commitment that government would make to accessibility. And from there on, we start working away at developing an actual piece of legislation. Next slide. And what was important is that, up until that point, most of the efforts related to persons with disability was taking place with what I could call within the social envelope of government, rather than in the human rights envelope of government. And when they started to develop the act, the community rose up and said, listen, the most important thing that you would do is to recognize that accessibility is a human right that is currently embedded in many pieces of legislation, not just within the province here, but also nationally and even internationally with the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So focus everything you do on this whole business of human rights. Next slide. And Ron gave you a definition of disability. There was a lot of discussion with community about that when the act was developed. And we had some great legal expertise as well that came in from Dalhousie School of Law, Archie Kaiser, Sheila Wilderman, and other professors, some of the leading human rights scholars in Canada, helped the community define what it should mean. And this is what it says. It includes a physical, mental, intellectual, learning, or sensory impairment, including an episodic disability that in interaction with the barrier hinders an individual's full and effective participation in society. I think it's perhaps the most comprehensive definition of disability that we currently have in Canada. And in fact, the federal government has adopted a lot of this into their recently approved Canada Accessibility Act. Next slide. Now, at the time when all this development was taking place, I was working as a volunteer in community. We were very successful as a community to have the government accept what the community needed. The initial draft of the act was not very well done. The community rose up and asked the government for the community to be involved in actually redrafting the act completely. And for the first time in the history of our province, was the community invited to sit at the table to redraft a piece of legislation. And as a result of that, we have what we have today, and all of that, of course, is available online. But what was also important was how the government implemented the act. And at the time, they tapped me on the shoulder and they asked me to come out of retirement to help implement the act. I'd had some experience, not at implementing legislation on disability, but I've worked as a consultant around the world, modernizing governments. So I knew a little bit how government behaves and operates and what buttons to push to get action and what approaches to take. And what we decided to take when they appointed me was quite a different approach to implementing a piece of legislation. And I call it rapid results with simultaneous activity streams. Generally, what government does when it has a piece of new legislation, it goes through a planning phase, then it goes through a development phase, then it goes through an action results phase. And quite often it takes too long, especially when you engage community. People get tired, fatigue sets in, disenchantment sets in, and the whole thing becomes a bit of a mess. So we ran these three sort of activities simultaneously. Quite a challenge, but I'd done it before in various projects around the world. Next slide. The first thing, of course, was the planning. And what the government had committed to do in its act at the request of the community is it made a commitment to make our province accessible by 2030. And what does that mean? So we've asked the government that when its first year of the act, that it put together a plan of how it's going to get to 2030. And that was done within the first year, and it's called Access by Design 2030. And that title is important, Access by Design. You design accessibility in at the front end, the cost is virtually nil. And I'm not just talking about the built environment, I'm talking about programs, policies, procedures, hiring practices, what have you. And the other thing that we asked the government to do was to actually prepare its own plan of how it as an organization was going to get there. And here we're dealing with various government departments, and that was done as well. And that's a 3-year rolling plan that they have put in place now on making some very significant achievements of meeting this need for greater accessibility. Next slide. Now this whole is on development. And one of the things that we heard when we worked with community, and that we worked a lot with community, was people with disabilities were saying the most important thing government can do was create greater awareness. When business and others becomes aware of the potential of bringing in a greater customer base, people will perhaps change their ways. And the other, and this is based on our review of international sort of best practices, was the development of standards. So there's clarity on what is expected from community, from government to make things accessible. And of course, the whole development of partnerships. Government cannot do it on its own. And of course, it's all level of governments, from the federal down to the municipal level. We see municipalities playing a critical role, especially on the physical infrastructure. So we have partnerships with them. We also worked with our educational institutions, such as CONCEPT, which stands for the Council of Nova Scotia University Presidents. In that, a lot of these barriers that are in our way have been put in place by professionals who generally are educated at the university level. So let's change things that take place at the educational level, so that when we graduate people within the various professions, they graduate with an accessibility lens ready and planted. And that's also part of the capacity building. Next slide. Now, this is probably my favorite thing, was sort of all the actions and results that we also sort of ran simultaneously. And you'll see various ones on the screen here. Of course, you know, business got very concerned about the potential cost of all of this. So the government made a commitment and they put in place a business program for accessibility. You see the ramp there. That's that portable ramp that I talked about, that I offered for free to one of the merchants that he refused. We did a partnership with Rick Hansen and his foundation. They have a whole certification program that certifies buildings so to ensure that they're accessible. We work with organizations like CarShare, the not-for-profit, and we help them fund a fully accessible van that's available to anyone. It's the first, I think, in Canada. HRM stepped up to the plate. For example, the entire Cogswell interchange, the largest redevelopment project in Atlantic, Canada, is now Rick Hansen Gold certified, which means that anything going in there is going to have to be designed to the highest standard. We've also done a lot of work with children, where we have people with disabilities reading to children about their disability. An example would be a session we had in the North End with some deaf individuals who rode using ASL. We taught the kids some ASL, and the impact that has is just tremendous with the children. You see the accessible beach that you may have noticed. That's been featured in many articles in media and elsewhere. And this is in the community of Inverness, one of the smallest communities really in Cape Breton. They raised monies through bake sales and what have you to put in place an accessible beach. And of course, we have Will Brewer, the young man with Down syndrome, who now is the town crier for the city of Halifax proper, as they used to say. So next slide. So lots going on the action front, and that continues, not just initiated by government, but a lot of it initiated by community. The other thing that the commitment the government made was that they would set up an advisory board that would advise the minister. And in this case, it's the Minister of Justice, who's responsible for accessibility. So we have this board now, it's 12 volunteers. I call them the apostles of accessibility for the province, representing most disabilities that we have in our province. Next slide. Of course, there's been a lot of discussion about aging in place, and it's what most seniors want. It's certainly not something that I want, and which I'm doing currently, but it will require for government to step up for it to really for it to take place. One, for the province to adopt and enforce acceptable accessibility standards. We have some really good standards in our current building code, but they are not being consistently implemented across the province. The other is nothing works in isolation. So for the government to adopt what I would call a citizen-centric delivery model for home care, and home care and housing need to coexist, and as well for government to fund assistive devices for independent living. I didn't realize until I became disabled that wheelchairs are not covered. And I discovered that when I was in the rehab center. I met all these particularly young people from rural communities who became disabled through a car accident or a hockey incident or what have you. And their parents would have to have community suppers to raise enough money for their son or daughter to essentially have legs, because they couldn't afford to buy a wheelchair. So we need to tackle that. Next slide. Now, there is help currently available from government for accessibility. They have a community accessibility program, and this is meant for community groups like churches, for their facilities to become more accessible. As I mentioned earlier, we have a business accessibility program now, so that businesses can apply to, and they basically covers about 3/4 of their cost through a grant. And as well, we have a program called Access, a home program for both homeowners and landlords for residences to become accessible. But I think we could do much more than that. For example, I think HRM made a good move about 4 or 5 months ago about allowing secondary suites and backyard suites to be built. Unfortunately, there was no requirement for those backyard suites, which are generally referred to as granny suites, to become accessible, which is an unfortunate move on their part. And hopefully that'll get corrected. Next slide. So I finish with that, and look forward to questions and any information that you need regarding these programs. Send the request to Ron, and you'll pass it on to me, and I'll get it to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gerry. Appreciate that. Jacquie, if I could ask you to separate in now. We're running a little bit behind, but if anyway, very important conversation that I'd like you to share with us, please.
Great. Thanks, Ron. And just a note, I can't actually upload my slides because I don't have those permissions. So I'm not sure if, Bill, you're able to allow me permission to share my screen.
You can now.
Awesome. Oh, that's a busy screen, isn't it? Okay, bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Can you see my slides okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great,
Good.
thanks. So before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work and play in Mi'kma'ki, which is the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq, and that we are all treaty people. I'd like to thank CARP Nova Scotia, Bill, Ron, and Paula for inviting me to be with you today to talk very briefly about something that's very near and dear to my heart and maps on to both the issue of accessibility as well as inclusion, and that's the issue of housing as a key determinant of health. And I think Gerry alluded to that in his talk, that this is an incredibly important issue, particularly for older Canadians. So I'm going to be focusing my brief comments on a piece of work that we've done that was funded through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council through a partnership grant. And so what I'm going to do ever so briefly for the sake of time is just talk a little bit about some background issues around lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, two-spirit issues. So for those of you who are not familiar with that acronym, it's sort of referred to as the rainbow acronym. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the purpose of this C.A.R.P funded study, and then give you a little snippet of some of the key findings. But I just wanted to make a note on terminology, and this is really important in terms of issues of inclusion, because you may know some of these terms, or you may have seen some of these terms before, but the reality is how we talk about LGBTQ2AIS plus Canadians depends in part on who is messaging. And so on this slide, you'll see a number of different terms and their application. So for example, the second term in this list, the LGBTQ2, is used by the Government of Canada. So again, when we're talking about understanding how current policies or programs that are aimed at diversity and inclusion actually meaningfully speak to these populations that have been historically invisible, if you will, from lots of policy interventions, I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. Different terminology and different applications, the point being this speaks to both inclusion and equity issues. At Dal, for example, the university I work with is grappling with these issues as an institution in terms of their commitment through their strategic priority 5.2 around equity, diversity, inclusion, and I would argue accessibility. So just a couple of pieces of background information for those of you who may not be familiar with LGBT, older adults, and health and social inequities. And I'm using LGBT in this instance because we're talking about a generation of folks who were born at a time where same-sex sexual activity between consenting adults was criminalized up until the year 1969. So for that generation of individuals whose fundamental human rights were not protected under current human rights legislation, this is an important issue because using the word in 1964, some of the other acronyms were not used at that time and or are considered sort of pejorative. So for baby boomers, even decriminalizing same-sex acts was a watershed, but it certainly was not enough. So violence by police, police raids, people being fired from their jobs, etc., not being rented to because they are a same-sex couple, not being able to qualify for a mortgage because they're a same-sex couple. All of those things, I think, factor into why housing is a key determinant of health is so important for this population. And on this very busy slide, you'll see the Government of Canada sort of kind of Reader's Digest version of key LGBT to policy developments in Canada. So as I mentioned,
You cut out again there, Jackie. Seems like the whole thing's, it's like everybody, like Cecil's frozen too here in the picture.
Yeah, she seems to have frozen. A couple of people are.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Jackie, can you hear us at all? Or hear me? Any suggestions, Bill? Jackie, looks like you're on mute there. Can you turn your mute on?
yeah, hi there.
There you go. I don't know what happened, Jackie. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I don't know either. It's something going on in the basement, no doubt. So let me just skip along then to this slide. And so one thing I wanted to note was that the Prime Minister of Canada in 2017 apologized for the 4 decades long purposeful purging of LGBT folks from the civil service, the RCMP, and the military. And this apology has come about from activism within the community to actually be recognized and to have their purposeful exclusion from those institutions as viable places to be employed. And so again, we can sort of see this movement in Canada around policy developments being really important, but I would argue insufficient to fully address what we mean by inclusion. And this has implications, I would argue, for issues of health outcomes. So just briefly on this slide, you can see various iterations of the determinants of health, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And again, depending on which literature you're looking at, there's different definitions of determinants of health, but the takeaway message around determinants of health is if you look at how individuals who are perhaps not part of mainstream society or have historically been excluded from mainstream society and institutions and policies due to racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., this has a very real impact on their health outcomes. And we know that there are a variety of structural determinants of health, including those in relation to housing, that can actually affect the health and well-being of particular socially marginalized or historically marginalized populations. So if you look at the schematic on the bottom of this slide, you'll see that in the US, for example, there are quite a number, actually the majority of states don't have explicit protections against employment or housing discrimination on the basis of both sexual orientation and gender identity. So again, this creates a problem in terms of issues around being able to rent a place and being able to rent a place in a neighborhood or in an area that is safe and affirming for older LGBT folks. Just briefly, the work that we're doing on housing in the Canadian context grew out of the earlier work we were doing in the European Union, where we actually looked at housing as a portable benefit. We also looked at some interesting innovations and programs that were available in select EU states that would allow for older LGBT adults to age in place. And I think we've heard a little bit of that, the importance of aging in place in Gerry's talk. We also heard about the importance of access to housing as well in Cecil's comments. So, thinking about how important housing is across the life course, what we took away from the EU examples was, Canada is falling behind other OECD countries in terms of their approach to safe and affirming housing for older LGBT communities. So here we are in terms of our the research that we did that was funded through C.A.R.P. We did 3 things. One, we did an international scoping review of existing policies. We also looked at data nationally from older LGBT Canadians, and we conducted a focus group, or a series of focus groups actually, to workshop the information that we found in those earlier data points with seniors from the LGBT community in Halifax, Winnipeg, Calgary, and Nanaimo. And so you can see this schematic just basically shows that for our online survey, we had just shy of 1,000 respondents. So these are folks who would be 55 years of age and older.
Hi, Jacqueline. Sorry to cut you off there, but I don't think anybody's seeing the slides. I know I am, and I see a couple people in the chat that can't see them as well.
Oh, right. Okay. Huh. I don't know why that is the case. Hang on just 1 second.
I'm just thinking here that, and unfortunately, I know we ran into technical problems, and we anyway. Long story short is we've got about 20 minutes left for some questions that I hope we want to get into. I know we want to get into. So Jacquie, right after you finish off there, if we could. I'm going to take questions from our audience for each individual panelist, and we'll just keep going from there.
Yep, that sounds good. So I'm going to kind of cut to the chase a little bit if that's okay. Just in terms of some housing challenges that we heard, rising rent, not surprising, being evicted, foreclosures, negative housing experiences. 36% of our participants said yes, they had had a negative experience. And when we asked what was it in relation to, it was in relation to issues of housing providers not being comfortable with LGBT folks in their housing facilities. So from the focus groups, we actually heard some key issues. So the lack of LGBT focused options for older LGBT Canadians, the need to hide one's sexual orientation from residents or housing providers for fear of harassment or violence, and trying to not be too out, quote unquote, and this has been referred to as the final closet, whereby older LGBT seniors will go back into the closet and hide their identity, which could be 60 years, 70 years of their life, for fear of being discriminated against in housing facilities. So again, what can we do with this? We can advocate for more focus in national programs on the needs of both older and younger LGBT Canadians, and this concept of intergenerational justice was brought up in our work. So what we do now, for example, may have implications for subsequent generations. And I think that's noteworthy. And Gerry's point about, Nova Scotia having a huge gray tsunami, I want to say around the corner, but I think it's here. And then developing a business plan and bringing that to the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, because we know that there's a $55 billion housing strategy, the first of its kind in Canada, and maybe this is an opportunity to look at whether or not there's possible supports there. So I will stop there. I just wanted to note one thing about accessibility, and then I promise, Ron, I will stop. It's really about this notion of accessibility that is foregrounding access as, in some people's minds, and I'd love to hear people's questions and thoughts about this. So for example, at Dalhousie University, accessibility is not just the physical spaces on campus, but it's also, is it affordable? So in other words, who can afford to access post-secondary education? I think this is a really important issue to think about. So access or accessibility and inclusion have diverse meanings and iterations depending on the context that you're speaking about. But in conclusion, around housing, issues of access to safe, affirming housing for older LGBTQ folks is still quite a significant gap. Thanks very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Jacquie, for an excellent presentation, and thank all of you for a great presentation. I'd like to jump right into questions right now, if I could. We've heard up from all three panelists, and we've heard from Cecil and his experience of discrimination because of the color of his skin. We've heard from Gerry and from his discrimination experience because he uses a wheelchair. And we've now heard from Jacquie, and she shared what's happening with the discrimination around sexual orientation. And so this is all a part of starting a conversation and going from there. So if I could start out, maybe I'll take a question from Cecil, and then one for Gerry, and then one from Jacquie, and we'll just keep going around like that, if that's okay. Everyone hear me okay? So if there's questions, either in the chat box. Bill, how do I get to the point where I can see everybody? Oh, I go to view and go to gallery up there. Is that, yeah, that's it. All right. So we're going to take, I'd like to take questions from our audience now. So does anyone have a question for Cecil? There's got to be some questions out there.
I do.
Okay. Is that Diane?
Yes, it is. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can't see you, Diane, but I see your name there. Please go ahead.
Cecil, a question for you. Who other than your parents played the biggest role in keeping you grounded while growing up?
Well, that's a great question. And I apologize for getting booted out, but I'm telling you, I just got kicked out. Who was it other than my parents? My sports coaches played a huge role, you know, when I was in high school, particularly, because you never want to get on their bad side if you wanted playing time. So you did whatever they said. One of my classmates, her parents, we used to go over her house quite regularly, and her mother was a reporter for one of the local papers. So she would tend to be up late at night, you know, finishing off her stories. And of course, we'd be out running around. Then we'd come in late at night hoping that she was, you know, asleep. And she wasn't. She was right there, and she'd always look at us, you know, give us the once over as we came in. And she became like a second mother to me, someone who was very influential. Sometimes I think for teenagers anyways, you pay more attention to what your friends' parents tell you and not so much what your own parents tell you. And that was certainly the case with this lady. She was a great, great woman.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Cecil. That sounds like the kids coming up at our house here too. So, Gerry, a question for Gerry. Does anyone
I've got one for Gerry, if I might, Ron.
Yeah, please,
Gerry, you
David.
mentioned that the Accessibility Act was targeted 2030. So what does that mean? What are we going to see by 2030? Or what do we hope?
What we hope to see, and I will keep the government to that, is for all the standards to be in place, the 6 standards that Ron mentioned, and there be a significant improvement. I think there'll always be challenges, and we'll find new challenges even beyond 2030 on accessibility, but that all standards be in place, and as well that all government activities adhere to accessibility standards.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gerry. Okay, question for Jacquie. Does anybody have any questions there? I see your hand up there, Paula. I think you're on mute, maybe. You need to turn your mute off, Paula. You're still on mute, Paula, if you can hear me. Okay, anyone else have a question?
Well, while Paula is finding hers, Joan has asked, not sure who to ask, but who would you contact to find out about getting funding to put in automatic doors in an existing condo?
I guess that would be to you, Gerry.
Yeah, well, I will send, it's the, for an existing condo to be a condo corporation, that would be through the accessibility business program. And in my slides that I provided, I think I've given an email or a web address there of the Accessibility Directorate, and a lot of the data and links are there.
Okay, all right, thanks, Gerry. I'm going to ask Jacquie a question. What can be done to address the issues you've found in your research? Jacquie, can you hear me there? I think your mute might be on, Jacquie. I think Bill, is she?
Jacquie, you are able to unmute yourself. You're not muted at my end.
So in your bottom left-hand corner, there should be a mute button there.
Depends on what device you're using.
Yeah, thanks.
There you go.
Yeah, thanks for that. I had to be unmuted by the leader of the band. So what can be done by this, done about these findings? I mean, I think increasing awareness, I think having conversations like CARP is sponsoring today so that other people are aware of these issues. You know, and sadly there was a housing project that got started called, it has escaped me. It was a church that was trying to convert itself into Spirit Place. There we go. Spirit Place. And unfortunately it fell apart. And part of the reason why that fell apart was that there was backlash towards saving a designated spot in that very small housing facility for an LGBT senior. And that there was such animosity and frustration in the dialogue that eventually people just walked away from the table. So I think, you know, we need to come to these conversations with an open heart and an open mind. I think that will help. And I think increasing awareness of the fact that, you know, issues of systemic racism, sexism, and homophobia have not been addressed, and we need to do more to make sure that we are thinking at an intersectional level. So it's not enough just to say, well, we don't discriminate against Black people, or we don't discriminate against lesbians, or we need to do a little bit more of a nuanced think about how to meet the housing needs of these populations. And I think the best way to do it is to increase our tolerance and understanding and increase visibility about why these issues have not yet been solved. And I think, Ron, the answer to that question is, you know, we all have a role and a responsibility to advocate for change. Thanks.
Thank you, Jacquie. Danelda, are you out there connected? No? Okay. Cecil, a question for yourself. Can you remember how you really felt during those elementary years and incidents of racism?
He's frozen again.
Cecil, are you there? Oh, we got frozen people again. We're having our challenges today, folks.
And Paul is still on mute.
All right.
Ron, Jacqueline Campbell, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, Jacqueline. Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I've been thinking as I've been listening to the presentations about age-friendly communities. And one of the things that Gerry, you said was, you know, the importance of the citizen-centric delivery. And my understanding of that is really, you know, about putting that focus on first person involved in informing and being a part of informing and leading and designing the development of, be it policies or services that affect them. And I feel there's a strong connection with how age-friendly communities can support that. And I just wanted to raise it because there's a number of folks I see on this webinar that are familiar with that. And I think it could be valuable in the future to explore more of those connections so that as citizens and folks working in community, we know how we can support some of the goals and objectives of the accessibility legislation, as well as all of the other issues that we've been talking about today around inclusion and diversity and equity. I just wanted to put that out there. And I know, Ron, that you've been involved with a lot on the age-friendly front as of late. So don't know if you want to make a connection to it.
No, look, Jacqueline, I really appreciate you saying that. And Gerry, I'd appreciate any comments you might want to share with everyone on that, because I know that Jacqueline works very hard in that area.
No, I certainly appreciate that. You know, that's sort of been my whole life, actually. My background is in city planning. And I got involved in that in the early 70s because of my involvement in community at the time, and sort of got dragged into city politics in Toronto way back when. And so engaging community, and that's what we've done with the Accessibility Act. You know, that's how I got engaged as a volunteer. And then we basically forced the government to listen to us, because they say, listen, if you're trying to help us, consult us, you know, and you know, not just by having a public meeting, but let's sit down and discuss it in real terms. And I think the smartest thing that the disability community did at the time, because I said earlier, this whole discussion about accessibility, you know, and in fact, all the issues we're talking about today centered around human rights. And so, you know, that's why we contacted the Dalhousie Law School. And when we engaged that expertise as a community, that's when government sat up and took notice of us. Because when we sat down to renegotiate basically what they had drafted, all the lawyers sitting on the government side had been students of the people advising us. It was an unintended power play, but it worked. So there are a lot of resources out there that community can bring together to help us achieve what the community aspirations are. And the last point I'd like to make, at least on the area that I'm covering on accessibility, the politicians get it. And it's the numbers, you know, like 41% of seniors have a disability.
Yeah.
Guess where politicians hang out at election time, right? They're at Tim Hortons in the morning to meet the old farts, sit there, discuss politics, and to meet the ladies in the seniors home in the afternoons, right? Yeah. So we got to play on that, right? Yeah. And keep on reminding that. And then that's how we basically developed sort of this whole thing of engaging community and really of organizing ourselves is so important.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And that applies to all three of the groups that we're talking with here this afternoon. And so we can all take a page from one another. Cecil, I'd like to.
Ron, may I ask a question, please?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, yes, please. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I was muted there for quite some time. Anyway, my question actually is to Cecil and to Jacquie. As a school teacher, as a school administrator, I always, when I was teaching, when I was at work, telling my students never to use the N-word, for one thing, and not talking about or characterizing people as being queer. But yet within these communities, you know, within the Black community, you hear Blacks using the N-word. And in the LGBTQ community, you have the Q. I find that not a double standard, but I find it difficult if you're talking to white people, never to use the N-word, but Black people use the N-word, and never to characterize people as being queer. And people themselves call them queer. I'd like some, I guess, clarification on that. And for Gerry, I just wanted to say I'm the chair of the Accessibility Committee of the Municipality of Argyll. Thank you.
Cecil, you want to take that first, and then I'll go to Jacquie?
Yeah, personally, I don't use the word. I'm not supportive of those who do. And a lot of the music that our youngsters listen to, you know, a lot of the hip hop and a lot of the rap music contains that word, as well as negative connotations to women. I don't like that either. However, if somebody uses that word, you know, to me, that's their issue. And, you know, who am I to jump in there and tell them that they should or shouldn't use any language? You know, that's why we all have, you know, free speech. but it would not be something that I would pat somebody on the back for. And if anybody asked me my thoughts on that word, I would tell them that it's a very painful word that I have heard many times on the athletic field, that I just use as strength to make a good play on the next play, if you know what I'm talking about. And I'm talking about, you know, using every bit of fiber and strength in my body so that they would never use that word again. And I've had some players come up to me afterwards and shake my hand for the way I conducted myself when they themselves were trying to agitate me to that point rather, by using that word. So that's how I would personally feel about it. But like I said, that's my own personal opinion, and I can't expect anybody else to adopt my thought.
Thank you, Cecil.
Sure.
Jackie, can you comment on what Earl was saying?
For sure. So thanks for that question, Earl. I think that the issue of queer, if you think about that word, it had a negative or pejorative connotation to it at a time when queer was defined as odd. And so using queer with a generation of folks who grew up at a time where that could be used to psychopathologize your sexuality or your gender expression, it's a very powerful word, and there's a generational divide in terms of who will accept that and use that term and who won't. And sort of to Cecil's point, you know, the younger generation are okay with queer. Older generations are not, and it's a disrespectful word to be used, and it has a lot of harm. But reclaiming the word by younger generation has, you know, the kind of dismantles the power and the harm in that word, because it's sort of throwing it back at people in a way that's supposed to take the power away from them and reclaim the power that word has within the community. The other issue, and I talked about this in my opening part of my talk, is that, you know, queer is also in the acronym Q, and sometimes Q is actually used for questioning. So when in doubt, if somebody uses puts Q in their rainbow acronym, you should query them, no pun intended, about whether or not they mean queer or questioning. But again, to my point, Earl, it has a generational divide, and I think depending on who you're talking to, you want to be careful how that term is used. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and thanks for the question, Earl. I'm going to try to, because we're a little over our time right now, and I know we're running a little behind, but I'd like to have one more question for each of the panelists before we wrap up, if that's okay with everyone. And Helen, I see your hand up there.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you, CARP, for doing this. I have a question, I guess, for each of the panelists, just in terms of the ism that wasn't addressed, but I think weaves across all of these issues, and which is ageism, and how we, as a community, can address both ageism as well as the other isms. I think there's lots of lessons to be taken, but it's kind of another layer impacting the work that each of you folks or organizations and communities are doing. So how can we collectively bring that lens to strengthen the case for aging well, and how just because you're reach a certain date on a calendar that you're not past your best before time kind of thing.
Who wants to start with that one?
It's a small question.
Well, I would simply say that we have a strong advocate here alongside Ron and Bill Van Gorder, who, you know, you can't pick up a newspaper or turn on the news sometime without seeing Bill there advocating on behalf of we seniors, particularly in this COVID age. I think Bill has done a real good job getting the message out there on behalf of us here in Nova Scotia, as well as across the country. So that's one good place that we start.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Cecil. I fondly refer to Bill as the father of CARP, certainly within this region, and I think and beyond as well. So, but again, I think it's up to all of us to be champions in our own space for older people. Thanks for the question, Helen. Any other questions that are out there?
James had a question.
I had a
Okay.
question for Gerry. Hi, Gerry, how are you?
You're on mute, Gerry.
Gerry, I want to ask, what do you think the biggest challenge to reach an accessible Nova Scotia is?
There you go.
It's really it's an attitudinal thing, right? It's really it's awareness within community, and I've seen the changes in people once they've become aware of the barriers that the various persons with disabilities face in community. Generally, people will then accommodate and change. Unfortunately, we have, you know, the 5% where we need regulations for, but yeah, just greater awareness. And I think we need to start with the children.
Just to add to what you're saying there, I know that the Rick Hansen program is now being taught in the Nova Scotia school system around inclusion and accessibility, where a lot of our children that are in school, children, grandchildren, and so forth, are the teachers are being provided curriculum around inclusion and accessibility so that kids in the classroom can start that conversation, so that by the time their generation comes up, maybe meetings like this aren't necessary anymore. Let's hope so.
Exactly, and as well as that Rick Hansen program is now also being taught at the at Dalhousie University. So it's an elective, and hopefully that it won't be an elective. It'll become a requirement soon. So that universal design is embedded into the curriculum, because we need to be graduating students with an accessibility lens and other lenses ready implanted.
Cecil, over the last year or more, I have to ask you what the Black Lives Matter movement means to you, because it's such a profound, thing that's happened globally.
Well, I hope I'm able to get this answer out before I get the boot. But I would say that for me, Black Lives Matter means Black Lives Matter also. Black Lives Matter too. It's not about that Black lives are the only lives that matter. It's that it's Black men and women who seem to be getting killed, whether it be by a police officer or, the proverbial black on black crime. It just seems that, just turn on the television right now and you'll hear them talking about this young man who was just shot in the back of the head in North Carolina. And then of course, the George Floyds of the world. I'll take it even all the way back to Rodney King, which was the first incident that I can remember seeing that I thought a Black person was being brutalized at the hands of a police officer, or in that case, at the hands of many police officers. But Black Lives Matter is not the Marxist type of organization that some people seem to be calling it, mostly politicians. Black Lives Matter is an organization that is trying to secure the rights and safety of Black people so they can go walking out on the street without being worried about whether they're going to be abused and assaulted. That's what it is to me.
Thank you, Cecil. That's anyway, that was a question that had to be asked. So, yeah. Folks, look, I appreciate everyone that turned out this afternoon for this conversation. We are starting a conversation. It's not about. I hope that we leave this meeting here now, that it's not a case that we're just going to be say, well, okay, well that's over. What's on next? I hope we've